Okay, hi everybody. It is July 16th and welcome to our mid-July Tinderbox Meetup. Mr. Bernstein, is the developer Tinderbox, is not with us today. He is out at some meeting or such. Imagine that on a Sunday morning being somewhere else than with us. But and then Mr. Anderson should be on his way. He's about 15 minutes late. So you've got me for the next few minutes. My name is Michael Becker. We have this weekly Tinderbox meetup to talk about all things learning, knowledge management, and tools like Tinderbox, and then specifically Tinderbox itself. What we do is we go around the room and we invite and have new people introduce themselves, and then we talk about our projects that we're working on. If we have a theme, we jump into that theme. If we don't, we just talk about stuff. I actually do have a theme for us today. So but
I see a new name. I see a new name.
I see a new name too. I was going to jump into that. So Mr. Kenneth James, you mind introducing yourself to us and let us know what you're working on? If you're trying to get off, if you're speaking, you're on mute. If you're not, you're not. Okay, so there he is. Hey, Kenneth.
Where? No picture.
Oh, no picture and still no audio. All right, he will come back. Nope.
Scared him off.
Oh, no, he's there. He's there. All right, so Kenneth, Dave Rogers raised his hand. Yes, Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, I I wanted to mention that we've talked a lot about using regex in various applications in Tinderbox. I used ChatGPT to come up with the regex expression to accomplish the task I wanted. So I just wanted to mention that I got the tip from Dave Weiner, who posted about on Mastodon.
That is a great idea.
Yeah, well, so I took what ChatGPT offered with a grain of salt and plugged it into RegexRx, which is an app that I use. I also have BBEdit, but so I have a little app. I plugged it in. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, and then I plugged it into a test note and ran it with the attributes I wanted to work on. It worked there too. So then I rolled it into production. So it's a resource if you're struggling with regex. ChatGPT generally seems to do pretty well with that.
All right, and David Edding and I were joking before today's call. How quickly would we get into needing to define terminology, which is his favorite thing in the world, and it happened within seconds. So for those that may not be familiar with the concept of regex, it stands for regular expression, developed by a guy in the 50s when we talked about computer when they were developing the fundamentals of computer language. And essentially, regex is a sequence of characters or a syntax for parsing text. And we'll actually be able to give a demonstration of that today if we have time within today's session, because I had actually planned on talking about regex today. So that's quite funny.
Dave, how complex was your quest?
It was fairly simple. I mean, but it was complex to me because I have very little experience. But to look at the answer that it came back, if you read regex notation, I'm sure it made perfect sense to you. But to me, it was just hieroglyphics. All I knew it was plug and chug.
You mind sharing your screen with us so we can actually see what it is?
Every time I try and share the screen, it fails.
All right.
Yeah.
So, no worries. Okay.
And I need to sort that out.
Yeah. All right. So do we have, if there aren't any other topics or questions, and I have to leave at the top of the hour at 10. So unless anybody has any other comments or questions, I'm going to take the floor and run you through a demo and concept that I've been talking about. And also this will be a precursor demo to a big piece of functionality that's being released in the 9.6 release, which should be out any day, any minute now. But before we do that, does anybody else have any comments, thoughts, questions, projects? It's like we've got some chat happening here. Oh, cool. That's right. Okay, so anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions? Shall we just jump right in? All right, let's jump right in. Okay, we don't have a formal theme today, so I thought I'd make one up. And I wanted to take us back to the basics because I think this will be helpful as we dig into the new, where'd you all go? Zoom, zoom, zoom. Huh, just a minute. I have got my big monitor, and I now can't find you all. Where'd you go? Zoom, Windows. There you are. Okay, hang on. Got it. Okay.
Michael, you might already know this, but we just see an orange blob.
I know, but I lost you all, so I couldn't find you on my 96 inches of high-res goodness.
I had a feeling.
So that is the beauty. There's the beauty and curse of having huge monitors is sometimes things get lost. All right, so we're going to start with the basics. So this is a Tinderbox file. And what I wanted to go through today is to walk through a demo of creating a unique process or project using all aspects of Tinderbox in a methodical, or as methodical as I can do it in the 15 minutes that I prepared for prior to this session, to be able to go through this process with you. And I wanted to start off with giving some basic definitions. So when we think about Tinderbox, the first thing we need to think about is this. Let me get myself oriented here in terms of terms. Note. Okay. Got it. Okay. So let's say I'm going to go up here and I'm going to create this new note and I'm going to call it definitions. And to make it easier for us to navigate through this process, I'm going to convert us to outline mode so we can be looking at the notes in outline mode. And the first definition I want to talk about is this concept called a note, or otherwise known in software language, an object. And a note is a field that has a field or data element that has unique attributes and behaviors. And so in Tinderbox, this is really important because everything revolves around this idea of a note. And when we talk about what's unique about a note and what's unique about particularly a Tinderbox object is it's a collection of both attributes, which I'll define in just a minute, as well as behaviors. And in the context of Tinderbox, those behaviors are what we call action code, meaning the things we tell the note to do or perform. And we'll give some demos of that in just a minute. So that is probably the most fundamental concept that we have to walk away with when we're using this concept of Tinderbox, or this tool we call Tinderbox, is this idea of a note. And when we're looking at the note from a UI and visual perspective, what you're seeing here is this is the text field, this is the name, everything else can be turned on, displayed, interacted with, and such. And what we need to realize is that, Tinderbox, the designer of Tinderbox specifically turns off as many as defaults as possible, because it's a tool for you to use for yourself, not a use for him to determine how you should be going about doing things. Now, the next concept that we want to think about when we understand or think about Tinderbox is this idea of an attribute. And an attribute is a piece of information that determines the properties of a field or tag in a database or a string of characters. And so when we think about the nature of a note in Tinderbox and we think about this concept of an attribute, well, what is an attribute? In Tinderbox, this is the attribute of text, this space here, this white box here. This is an attribute of the name of the Tinderbox, of the note. And if you hit Command 1, that pops up a utility we call the inspector. And the inspector lets you, interact with all of the various functionality within Tinderbox. And you'll notice there's two types of attributes in Tinderbox. There are system attributes, namely the attributes, the values that have been pre-programmed into Tinderbox by the developer. And then there are user attributes. And these are attributes that you can create yourself on the fly. And attributes, and that actually brings another type that I didn't think about, data type. So another term that we want to be thinking about then, a data type is, and I'll have to look up a formal definition of it, but the format of data for now. But let me just, and I'll come up with a more formal definition in a minute. But what a data type is the type of data. So if I want to go in here and I want to create a new attribute, let's say I'm going to create a new attribute and I'm going to call it owner. And I can give it a type, and that type can be anything from color to number to file to Boolean to date to set to URL to list to interval to dictionary. And then in Tinderbox 9.6, which we said is due out in any moment, any day now, a new attribute is being introduced, email. And that's something I'll be demonstrating in today's call. But for now, we're going to go ahead and make attribute a set. Now, it's really important for you to learn along the way the different types of data and what they mean. So a color is basically HTML hex codes. A number is a zeros through nines. It's numbers. File is the path to a file on your hard drive. A Boolean is a yes/no object, or excuse me, yes/no attribute. A date is a date. Set is a list of items that do not allow duplicates. A URL is obviously a URL. A list is a list of items that allow duplicates. An interval is basically time, and a dictionary is key pairing. So like cow : animal, ant : insect, and so you can essentially do key pairings. Now, when you're looking at dictionaries, lists, and sets, a big part of 9.6 is going to be what's called nested lists and nested dictionaries, where you could have lists within lists. And Mark has been doing a tremendous amount of work in developing the syntax for that. And that's another term we should probably define really quick. All right. And as the syntax in computing language is this. Syntax is the arrangement of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences in a language. And if you think about it, programming is nothing more than a language. And so you're needing to create well-formed sets of words to be able to instruct and tell Tinderbox what to do. Okay. And here's the definition of data type. So I can just pull that off of the web. Okay. So those are some of the, and when we look at Tinderbox, let's go ahead and think about the nature of an attribute. So as I said, I think there's over 600 different types of attributes that can be within Tinderbox. And you'll find those on ATB-Ref, which is a reference. Just a minute. Yes, Mr. Bruce.
Just a clarification question.
Yep.
If I'm choosing to use a Dropbox file or a Google Drive file, is that better referenced as a file or a URL? Or
totally
something?
Depends on the nature to which you're doing it. So if you've installed Google Drive or Dropbox on your hard drive and you're referencing the file from your hard drive, then you can use file. If you're referencing the file from the browser, then you want to use URL. So it's an important distinction, right? So if you've gone to Dropbox.com, you're using the URL. If you're going to Dropbox on your hard drive, and Dropbox is syncing the files to your hard drive, then you can use file. But keep in mind that if at some point you disconnect the Dropbox syncing or the Google Drive syncing to your hard drive, then those files will no longer be on your hard drive, and therefore then URLs there. So it's just really it's a preference and a strategy. I personally use both. It just depends on the context of my project.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me give you just a quick example of a system attribute. And there's a concept in Tinderbox called, and by the way, one of the most in the inspector, one of my most used tips is this thing called Quick Stamp. And Quick Stamp is a utility that gives you, instant access to any of the attributes in Tinderbox, and that both system and user generated. And then it allows you to stamp or apply a value into that attribute. And so, for example, if I go here and type the word color, you'll see that this note attribute is colors defaulted as 7. And that's just a numerical number notation that Mark has used to map the word 7 to in the behind the scenes to a particular type of color. So if I change this this word 7 to red and I hit apply, what I'm effectively doing is I'm changing the value of that attribute for this note from 7 to red. And the second I do that, that note becomes red. Or if I do it and I change it to blue, that note becomes blue. Or if I change it to orange, that note becomes orange. So you get the idea. Now, there's another attribute which is really exciting called displayed attributes. So because remember, Tinderbox uses these values of these attributes to power itself. And so a displayed attribute, if I type in the word color here, you'll see that the word color has, excuse me, it's capitalized. You see that the word color has now appeared in the display of the note of the object. And because an attribute is displayed attributes is an attribute of Tinderbox, and the displayed attribute of Tinderbox says whatever names of attributes that happen to be in this attribute displayed attributes, display them on the note. And so with that in mind, when you're thinking about the nature of Tinderbox, a critical concept for you to keep in mind is that every note has every attribute associated with it, whether or not it's displayed or not. And that's a really powerful concept that we'll be coming back to in just a minute. Now, those notes may not have values in them, or those attributes may not have values in them for that particular note, but the concept of that attribute is associated with every note. And that's a really powerful conceptual model of Tinderbox. And you'll also see that, just so we can emphasize it, if I hit it, and a displayed attribute is a list attribute. And so, for example, if I type in the word text, and lists are separated by semicolons, if I type the word name, and if I type the word text again, if you recall, I said lists allow for duplicates. So if I said color, text, name, text, what I'm saying is, hey, Tinderbox, create a list and then display that list in the displayed attribute. So when I hit apply, you'll see now in my displayed attributes, I get color, the attribute text, the name of the note, which is also another attribute, and I'm getting text again. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why he's made this a set, a list versus a set to enable for duplicates. But we can go into that later. And so essentially what you're seeing here, even though I'm seeing the text here, text is nothing more than just an attribute that is accessible via Tinderbox, so it can be in multiple places. And then if I hit this little button up here, this UI affordance lets me go up and manage the displayed attributes that I have in the particular note. So that's an important concept to keep in mind. Now, if you remember too, we created another user-generated attribute called owner too. And so there's the user-generated attribute we just created. Now, we've talked about notes, we've talked about attributes, we've talked about data types, we've talked about syntax. Now, the other really important concept that we want to talk about in Tinderbox is this idea of a prototype. And a prototype is important because it's an object, it's a note like any other note in Tinderbox. But if I go up to the file menu of Tinderbox, let me go here, go up to the file menu of Tinderbox, and I click on here, I can see that Tinderbox has a number of what we'll call built-in prototypes into it. And that's the kind of easiest way to organize that. So we're just going to go ahead and grab the built-in prototype event. And you'll see what Tinderbox has now done is it's taken and added this functionality of this folder called prototypes, or this container called prototypes, another term. And it's giving me this note. Now, this note event is a note, like in all of these other notes, but it has a unique property, a unique attribute value assigned to it. And if we come here, you'll see that it says prototype. And if we go here and we look at the quick stamp and I say is prototype, there's another attribute called is prototype. And what that's doing is you'll see that the value is checked, which means the value is true. And if we go back to the quick stamp here too, and we say displayed attributes, and I add is prototype to the list of attributes, you'll see I'm getting the Boolean object or attribute is prototype as checked as true. So what that's telling me is we're now making this note a prototype. And let's define the concept of prototype. What we mean by the word prototype is this. an original model which something is patterned off of. So in other words, what we're saying is, if I associate any other note in Tinderbox to this prototype, what I'm doing is I'm going to be patterning. I'm going to be patterning. I think that's the word. That note associated with the note that we've defined up here. So let's go up in here and create a meeting notes. We'll create a note called meeting notes, and we'll move that up here, and we'll create a note called meeting, and we'll say it's like 16 July 23 Tinderbox Meetup. Right. So I have a note here where I'm saying I'm giving it a name, today's meetup, and I'm now going to associate this this event, this prototype we're calling event, and I'm going to change it because I like to call it meetings. So for me, this is it says P for prototype equals a meeting, and I like using the badge for calendaring. So for this prototype now designates a meeting to me, and I can go right up, mouse click up here, and I can say, now I want this note, meeting July 16, 23 Tinderbox Meetup, to be associated with the meeting prototype. And you'll see instantly this note has now taken on the pattern of the prototype. Now that concept means that we now need to bring in another important computing terminology, which is inheritance. An inheritance term says a feature or process in which new objects are created from the attributes or patterns of an existing object, the process by which generic information is passed from one parent to a child. So what we're saying here is, when I associate this patterned object, this prototype, to this other note, this other note is inheriting all of those attribute values from the prototype to this note. And it's not just generically inheriting, like it's inheriting everything. But what's interesting is each of the attributes in Tinderbox are independently, and again, there's some edge cases here, but each of the patterns within Tinderbox are independently inheritable. So for example, if I go down here and I'm in a meeting, and you'll see that I've got, and this is something else you need to learn in Tinderbox too. If I go up here and I go to this and I type in systems and I type in participants, you'll notice that, okay, so participants is a set prototype value. So that's good. So we're going to keep that there. So let me come back to this, a different example then. I'm going to create another prototype while we're at it. Task. And the task prototype, I'll just give it a little check mark, is an activity or task we want to do. And we're now going to create on the fly several user-generated attributes. So we're going to say due date. We're going to pull in start date, which is a system attribute, end date, which is another start date, end date. And we're going to do checked. And the last thing we're going to do typically when you have tasks is you have some owner. All right. So we've now created another prototype we're going to call tasks. And so now that we're going to be able to have tasks associated with our meetings, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But this idea of inheritance, let's say I need to come up with a new okay, here, let's say you're doing this for clients and you wanted another user generated attribute is like, what project is this meeting associated with? So I'm going to go ahead over here and I'm going to create a set attribute. And so then when I click away now, I instantly now have a new attribute called project. And because I've added the project attribute to the meeting prototype, that is every node associated with this prototype is going to inherit that change. And so if you go up here, there's project. As opposed to if I go down here and I type owner, you'll see that the prototype does not inherit the owner because of the child-parent relationship. Yes, Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, that's on inheritance. One of the things that tripped me up early in Tinderbox with regard to outline structure and the terminology we use to define the relations between notes in the hierarchy, parents, child, descendants, and so forth, that has nothing to do with inheritance.
Nothing.
It can be a source of confusion when using these genealogical type terms in a object-oriented database type context.
So on that note, we should probably get rid of that definition there. This is an important definition. A feature or process which new objects are created from the attributes or patterns of an existing object. So essentially, when I assign this meeting note to this one, it's taking on the pattern and attribute values of that existing object. And so, for example, we can say, and the idea of inheritance too is I'm not just inheriting the attribute, but the actual value of the attribute. So we'll call this default project. And you'll see here that I've now defined within the meeting prototype, the project type default, the value of project is default project. And you'll get up here and you'll see that this note has inherited that value default project. Now, if I change it, we'll talk about it Tinderbox Meetup. Okay, what I've now effectively done, and you'll see this has become bold. You'll see that I've broken the inheritance to the value from that prototype. Now, if I re-inherit it, use the inherited value, it changes back to default project, Tinderbox Meetup. So what you can see is every note can disavow itself of the inheritance of its prototype, of its, and this is where the parent-child relationship, it's easy to call it the parent, the note that had birthed me, or that I was associated with, and it's not necessarily natural parents, it's adopted parents, if you will. I mean, think about that language, but that idea then is I'm essentially disassociating that value from that prototype. So now we're getting this this concept coming along. Now, a few other terminologies that we want to be able to think about in Tinderbox. So let me pause there. Does that make a lot of sense for everyone thus far?
Yep.
Okay. I just want to make sure I get all of my attribute. I'm gonna go down the list and make sure I get them right in the right order here. Okay. Now, Tinderbox has a few other concepts in it that are really important in terms of terminology. One concept is this idea of action code. And action code are the operators that Tinderbox uses to transform text. And what I mean by operators is AKA programming language. Okay. Now, Mr. Bernstein and others don't necessarily like to call it a programming language because it's not as robust as, say, Java or C or Ruby on Rails or any of the other, typical programming languages, but it is a language. It is a means to which you can give instructions to Tinderbox to do stuff. So that is a really important concept within Tinderbox. And then another critical concept in Tinderbox is this idea of export code. Now, export code is, Tinderbox's code for evaluating expressions, retrieving values, and essentially Tinderbox code for formatting outputs. And we could say could include evaluating expressions, retrieving values. That's probably the better definition. And to be more precise, we could pop this up here too, that, we use action code for transforming text. And in the process of transforming text, what we're doing is we're evaluating expressions and we're retrieving values. So this gets us up to, and then we have to ask ourselves, well, what do we mean by the term expression? And so then I'll go, an expression is a value or anything that executes and ends up being a value. So let me go ahead and give you an example of that. So we'll say this called test note, and Tinderbox has a built-in user-generated attributes for like placeholders. So here is a placeholder number attribute that we can play with. And if I open up Tinderbox and I am going to now do an application of the one-time application of Tinderbox action code, we'll say do math. And what we're going to say, and this is the basic format of Tinderbox, we're going to say my number. So the attribute on the left will equal whatever the results of the expression on the right are. So what this means is make the value of the attribute on the left equal to the whatever the result of the expression on the left is, or on the right is. So for example, we say make my number equal 2 plus 2, right? And hit semicolon, I apply that, and you'll see my number is now 4. If we make my number 2 plus 2 times 8, we see my number is now 18. And the reason why, do the math, 2.2 is 16 plus 2. If you wanted it to do it this way, you can now make it 32. So yes, Mr. Bruce.
And if instead of numbers, you want to use other attributes or variables, you can do that in this.
Do what in this and what in that? Give me an example.
If instead of fixed numbers, you want it to be a variable or attribute from elsewhere and plug that into the formula, you can do that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So I'll define this term later, but let's even say for the sake of this argument, we're going to create a variable on the fly, and we're going to say that that variable is a number, and vnum will equal 5. Right, and so what we're saying now is we're going to say make my number 2 plus 2 times 8 plus vnum. So now what we're saying is we're asking Tinderbox to take the value vnum and add it to this expression. And so when I do that, I can go up here and you'll see now it's 37.
So sure. So that's where you've defined it within the same body of code.
Right.
What I'm wondering is, let's say you had a number of participants and then you had a or you have a rate, and that's your can you use the word rate or participants as part of your formula?
And that gets me to the next term that is critically important and took me 3 years to learn. And the term in programming language is called an offset. And that's what you're effectively referring to. It's the value of an offset is the value of an offset indicates the location of the base variable within a variable relative to the start of the area. And I know that sounds, I just copy and paste that because remember, I started this demo 15 minutes before the call. So
that's actually, Michael, that's actually the same thing as it would be in a spreadsheet. So the concept is the same.
It is. So let's go ahead here and let's say our base value is this, and let's say my num. So what we're going to do is we want to say, I want to use the base value of 5 from the note base value. I want to grab the number 5 and include it in the calculation I'm doing with this note. All right. So all we need to do there, well, this is really not an offset in this example, but yeah, it is. Actually, we can say, let's make vnum, the variable vnum, equal to the value of my number. Okay, but the offset now comes into here is, well, which my number? If you just say my number, what you're saying is make vnum equal to my number, meaning this note, the one I'm currently acting on. And so when I do that, I'm going to get 37 plus 37, 69. And so now I can keep adding the existing value of my number for this note to this formula 2 plus 2 times 8. Now, if we want to go back, and we'll make that 0, and we get our 32. And the reason why it's 32 is my number in this context was 0. And so it was 0, 2 plus 2 times 8 plus 0. Now what we want to do is we want to practice an offset. And what you do is you say base value. So what we're now doing is we're telling Tinderbox, I want you to go get the offset. I'm offsetting the my number attribute to what? To the note named B base value. So that's what that's saying. I'm saying Tinderbox, go find the note B base value and then grab its number, which is 5. And just for the sake of demo, let's call it 10 now. So if we do that, what we're going to get now, and let's set this to 0. What we're going to get now is 32 plus 10. Whoops. Oh, I know, just a minute. That should have worked. My number, okay, let's double check this. So this is how you test it. So you guys, we'll say text equals vnum. So let's see what number we're getting. Oh, I know why. Because I'm selected on the wrong note. We're doing the test note. So if you see here, so it's actually not returning vnum. Base value. God, that's embarrassing. Oh, because now it's b value, vnum is 0. That's why it is. All right, so go 10, go here, and we say 42. Right? So what we're saying is make the value vnum equal to my number from the offset of the note b value. Does that make sense?
I have a question about that part. I
Mhm.
was following you up until you added base value. Because there's only one my number attribute, right? Regardless.
No, this isn't the important point. There is as many my number, there's only one my number attribute, but there is as many my number values as there is notes. Because every note has every attribute.
And so the attribute in note
Oh.
A is different than the attribute in note B.
No, it's not the
even
attribute.
when they're labeled the
The
same.
attribute is named my number, but what is the value of my number in note base value versus the value of my number in test note? The value of my number in test note is 42. The value of my number in base value is 10.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful.
Right? So that's when I go back and say every note has every attribute. You can pull the values from those notes at your whim. Let me give you another example. Let's say the base value here is URL. And I'm going to say, type URL correctly. And I'm going to say www.identitypraxis.com. Right? That's the value of the URL for this note. And I'm now going to say, I want to make the text equal to the URL of the note base value. Okay, but let me do it in a slightly different example. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to talk about the concept of container, meaning the container attribute says this note base value is inside the note meeting notes. And if I do the value path, you'll say this is the path of how I get to the note. So I'm going to copy this path and I'm going to go back to this statement here. And rather than saying quote base value, I'm going to say that. Right? Because that's essentially saying the same thing. Because what would happen if I had another note in Tinderbox called base value? Because you can have notes with duplicate names. And just for the sake of argument, let me put it somewhere else. So Tinderbox will always start from the top to bottom. So if it's looking for the note base value, it's going to find this one first and see that it's my number is 0. So it's not going to know which base value note you're talking about. So if you're doing this type of math, you can actually see, you can actually see, rather than using the name of the note as the offset, I'm going to use the path of the note as the offset. And that's allowed in Tinderbox. So now when I do that, if I go here, you'll see that it's smart enough to know, because let me just give you an example here. It's smart enough to know that I'm grabbing the URL from this note base value and populating it here. Now, if you notice here, if I don't use the path and I use the actual name, because remember, as I said, Tinderbox works top to bottom in a linear fashion. our vertical fashion, it's gonna see the first note base value and then stop there. And so now if I go grab that base value, if you look here, the value of URL in this note is empty. There's no URL here. So if I apply that to this one, it's grabbed the first note base value, saw that it had no value of URL, and so therefore now text is empty. But if I go back and grab the path of that note and make the path the offset, and then go back here, you'll now know I want you to go get the base value from the note base value, but I want you to get the URL from the path of this base value, and now it works. Yes, Mr. Rogers.
Okay, I think for the purposes of anybody coming to this video later, you've introduced a certain amount of confusion here. In a stamp called do math, you're retrieving text from an attribute URL that will never do any math. I mean, so
well, no. Well, it's do math and other stuff because we've let it evolve, right? It started out do math, and now we've let the stamp evolve.
Well, and that okay,
right? And you're not wrong, but you know that this is the nature of Tinderbox.
Well, I was like, why is he going to retrieve the value for a URL to do math? I mean, it just
but this is the nature of Tinderbox. Allow things to evolve, right? And this goes back to the naming of things. We started out with do math being about just being math, but as our logic evolved, do math became something else more, but we never went back and changed the name. And
so that's not a bug, it's a feature.
Well, no, it's just the way logic and recursive evolution works. And that's why David Eddy gets his undies in a bunch so much about the name and the definitions of terms. And the way this has worked is we've been evolving this stuff for years, more often than not, like in the sense of like in this example, as the programmer, I didn't go back and change the name of the stamp because I didn't need to, because I knew it.
Your head was somewhere else. Your head.
Well, I'm just saying that for somebody who's coming to this, it's a point of confusion, and I was trying to clarify it. Detlef has a good question of why you use quotation marks for the name of the note versus the path.
Right. Okay. And again, this is a convention. I don't want to go back to that one point you raised real quick. But this is the crux of David Eddy's 40-year quixotic journey. In that like software developers don't document, they rarely go back because they're often not funded to go back and redocument stuff. And that's just the issue we have. Mr. Anderson, did you want to answer Detlef's question?
Yeah, I will. It's sort of accidental. Originally, Tinderbox Action Code was a bit like AppleScript. The idea was you just wrote, I want some stuff, and the app figured it out for you. Action Code about version 4 got a lot more complicated, and it just couldn't guess what you wanted. So the convention became to put quotes around something that's a string of text. And at the same time, it was noticed that if you put a full path, when you're making an offset reference, so you say attribute name, parentheses, and something in it. If you put a full path in it, if you don't quote it, then Tinderbox will know that you will understand that what you're saying is, no, this is a path. You don't have to go and work out what this is. Just go use this path. If you put something in quotes, it'll go and look. It'll find all the things that match that and resolve it. Now, if it's a path, it shouldn't need to do it. But as I've just put in the chat, if you've got two notes with the same name in the same container, that's not going to work because the path is not unique. In that case, a furthering, and that I think arrived in about version 5, it exposed the internal universal ID. The problem with that is actually a number, and then some people who are doing
okay, so Mark, pause right there. So I'm going to go to that right now. So there are other ways to do that. So we can offset to a note by its name. We can offset to a note by its path. We can also, as Mark was just referring to, offset to a note in version 5. This idea of ID was introduced. So every note automatically gets generated a unique ID number for its note. But the issue is this is actually a number. So let me go up here, and here's another way of doing these kinds of things. We're going to say text plus equals. now we're going to say, let's say ID of, how do I want to do this? No, I don't want to do ID. Test equals plus equals URL of ID. So let's do that. All right. And what we're going to say here is plus, and this is regular expression, by the way. So what we're doing is we're telling Tinderbox to stick in a line break, because that will make it easier for us to learn, and we'll talk about this later. But now what I'm saying is, hey, Tinderbox, what I want you to do is I want you to go grab the URL for the note that has this path. And I want you to grab the URL for the note that has this ID number. Now, remember, this note has no URL, or let's put it note A. Let's give it, or let's call it Google. So this base value has the URL of Google. This base value has the URL of identity praxis. And I'm going to make the relevance of this in just a minute. So now if I go ahead and do this, you'll see it first got the URL for the path to the note expressed here, but now it went off and used the offset of the ID number of the note to go get the URL based from that version of base value. Now, as Mark Anderson was just explaining, one of the challenges is this ID number is a number. And in the context of your action code or your export code, there are times if you're not explicit and if you haven't written the code properly, and properly is the wrong term, but if you haven't been very clear to Tinderbox what your expectation is, Tinderbox may interpret that as a number. And then therefore say, multiply it by 2. And then what do you do? Because then now that ID number, that long string times 2 doesn't exist. So in 9.5, Mark Bernstein introduced another method. And let's go ahead here, and we're going to create a new base value down here. And this one, we're going to call this one Yahoo or Escape. .com. All right, and you'll see here, this note is 492 is its unique ID number. This note's unique ID number is 491. So you'll see that it incremented by 1 because this is the new note we just created. But this time, rather than using the ID number, what we want to use is IDString. And so IDString is another method of uniquely identifying a note, but doing so without a number. It's like the internal URI, if you will, for that note for Tinderbox. So if I hit copy here and I go back to this, and now I'm going to use the offset. So you're seeing here, basically, we have 4 different offsets to refer to a note. Its name, its path, its ID number, or its ID string. So now if we do that, and let's go ahead and add our line breaks to these stamps too, so that it works. Now, if we go ahead and apply it, you see now we're bringing in. So I'm saying I'm getting the base value for vnum from that note. I'm getting the URL from the note that's on this path. I'm getting the URL from the note that's up here, and I'm getting the URL for the note that is down here. And so this is like one of the most important concepts that you need to grasp in Tinderbox, is this idea of an offset, because it allows you to grab and manipulate and pull data from all over the place. Make sense?
Yeah, you might just add in, and the other thing you can do is when you're doing an offset, because it is using designators.
I was just about to get that.
Sorry. Okay, I'm skipping ahead.
yeah. But that's the yeah. So I gotta get a definition of a designator. What's a good definition of a designator? Because we need to put that in here.
Oh, let me have a look. I'm not sure. I mean, essentially, it's a special keyword that tells Tinderbox that, when I say child, I mean the first child.
Right. So Tinderbox has a range of different designators. So one is parent, one is child, one is descendants. Another offset is descended from, or I mean, a designator is descended descended from. Another one would be ancestors.
Very cool.
Another one is children, right? And so in ATB ref, you'll see all of these different types of designators. Now I'm going to create a new test note called test note 2 to define this one. And so that we don't, break our brains by continuing to refine this, do math and other stuff beyond the context of what we were really intending that stamp to initially be. And again, a stamp, just for the sake of definition in Tinderbox, a stamp is a tool for the one-time application of action code. Okay, so now I've got test note 2 here, and I'm going to create a new stamp, and I'm going to move test note 2 up here, and I'm now going to go I'm going to go here, and I'm going to say this. So I've got a new stamp, and this is going to be get children. And I'm going to put another note down here, say test note 3. Okay, so get children or descendants. So because I know where I'm going with this. And so I'm going to say, now what I want to do is I want to say, hey, Tinderbox, make the text value of this note that I currently have selected equal to, and now we have to give it another operation, equal to what? Well, what again, there's action code operations and activities. Mark, if you can drop ATB ref link in the chat, people will be able to see it. But I'm going to give you one of the most common ones I use, equal to the, you can use one called inside. So go find all the notes inside, and let's use one of our designators. ID, or let's use IDString, because that's what we should try to use. So I'm going to say, go find me all of the notes inside this note, meaning notes. And what I do, and then what I want you to do is then, yeah, so if I do that, whoops. Okay, that's not going to work. So then I'm going to say, what I want you to do is I want you to collect. Okay, yeah, and this is a better example anyway, since we're doing our offsets. What I want you to do is I want you to collect. Basically, I'm asking Tinderbox, go collect something. Well, what I want you to collect, I want you to collect the children of the offsetted note, this one, and then I'm going to ask Tinderbox, what do I want you to collect? I want you to collect the name. Okay, and this brings up another definition that we need is arguments. An argument are the instructions given to the code, right? So here, what I'm saying is make the text make the text the result of this expression. And the result of this expression is go collect the children of this offsetted note. And what do I want you to collect? I want you to collect the name of the notes. And so if I hit this now, I get, and what collect does, the action of collect returns a list of the notes. And you'll see I've now got a list: meeting, test note, base value note. And now if I want to say, okay, well, what I want more, I want you to get me the descendants of that note. And so now if I do that, I'm now getting test 3, because this, test 3 is not just a child of this note, it's actually a descendant. It's a child of a child.
Spell it with an A, I think.
What?
Spells it with an A, I think.
Bruce says Bruce, do you want to tell us where you got lost? Because I think this is very pertinent, and it's entirely, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's really useful to know
Well,
at what point you lost.
Sure. Michael, I put in chat because I felt like I was sitting on top of the comment with you maybe 10 minutes ago, that you were doing something very step by step. And then I'd asked a question about the variables, and I feel like since then, I'm not exactly sure where we're headed. And I know that you have to leave in 6 minutes.
Well, okay, so where we were headed with this was you need to understand all of these key concepts within Tinderbox. So let's go back to where we started, and we can revisit this next week. But I'll give you a quick demo on this just so you can ultimately know where we're headed. What we've talked about is, well, what's Tinderbox? It's notes, it's attributes, it's types of data, it's syntax, the language we use. It's this idea of prototypes. It's this idea of inheritance. It's this idea of code we can use to transform the elements. It's code we can use to export elements of the elements. It's this idea of expression that we can tell Tinderbox to go perform an action and return back a value. It's this idea of variables, places we could park a value until we need to use it. This idea of offset, that we can then go and grab values from anywhere within the file and bring it back to the operation that we're currently underway. And then we start getting these concepts of designators, meaning that we can then say, well, then how do exactly what are we using to tell Tinderbox to do? So as we talked about just now, we're saying, hey, Tinderbox, go collect some data. Well, where do I want you to collect it from? I want you to collect it from the children or the descendants of that note. And what do I want you to get? I want you to get the names. And so that is, this really fundamental core concept to Tinderbox. So now let me tell you and show you what do I mean by, or what, where ultimately, if I had the other half an hour, I could have, we could have done it. But you can take this, this even farther. So let's say we're in this note, this meeting, and I'm going to top in some text. Right. So we're in the meeting and we're having this great meeting and we're talking about all this stuff. And as I'm talking about it, I'm going to add some tasks in, and I'm going to say, at Becker, publish today's meeting, task at Bruce, share with us other questions, task, at all, comment to the post.
See, I thought where you were headed and using the metaphor of a project, I thought was wonderful because everyone can identify with that.
Right.
And as you're moving along, and one of the things that occurs to me is also, what part are you doing in real time? In other words, you're in the meeting, you're taking the notes. Sounds like there's certain nomenclature that needs to be used to make it meaningful. And then later you're doing some, what I'm going to call post-processing to make it work as well. So that's part of the flow, right?
Yeah, that's part of the process. And let me show you here. And maybe Mark, you can pick up from this and explain what I'm about to drop in. I'll email this file to you right when I drop off.
Okay.
And you can pick up from this. But let me show you. I'm going to now drop in some code and do some automagical hand waving, which then
so one concert pianist has to leave in the middle of the concert and the second one picks up.
Yeah, but we're just that good. So that's,
well, I'm saying this will be good.
So here is I'm now going to drop into the new Tinderbox feature. I'm going to add in hints, and I'm going to drop in some code. Where did my hints go? Oh, wrong file. We're going to go hints. All right, and we're going to open up, and Mark, you can explain all of this in just a minute. And I'm going to go ahead here and change this code real quick. Okay, you don't need contract, you don't need clients. Project name we've got, and source you don't need. Yeah, that's a different way of doing it, but yeah, let's go. Okay, yeah. So then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new attribute here called, in my task called source. All right. So let's say I am now taking, that's a string. So let's say I'm now I've taken my meeting notes, and I now have this stamp in here that I have created. And what do I want to do here? Okay, this is the wrong one. I need to add one more. I need to do this one. I also need this stamp.
I also want to comment, Michael, early on, your level of preparation for this, I know others are too. I'm really grateful for you putting in the time to kind of present it in this way.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. So I'm going to hand this off to you now in about a minute, but let me just explain to you what we did here. So I've got a stamp that goes through and says, hey, Tinderbox, I want you to perform all of these actions that we have just done. Here are the variables that we've discussed. I want you to create an expression. Give me the source of this task. The source of this task is the name of this note, the date of right now, and the document name of the Tinderbox file I'm currently working with. What I then want you to do is I want you to then go look at the current text of the note you're on and interrogate each line of the text. And as you're interrogating each line of the text, if it starts with the word task or the pattern task, I then want you to go and actually create that note and apply the prototype vtask. Make the owner, by using regex, as Dave Rogers just explained us, to part the @ sign out of the name and populate that into the owner task, and then do this. And Mark will be able to explain this as we're leaving. But now let me go and let me show you what's going to happen here, and it's just wickedly cool. If I go up here now and I hit stamp, and I'm now going to apply the meeting task or extract task attribute, Tinderbox has now automatically gone out and created. Oh, and I've got to turn off. And this was driving Lou crazy the other day. You'll see these little placeholders. In 9.5, Mark introduced this concept called @places, such that if a note had an @ sign in the name of the note, he thought that you were wanting to automatically create a place. It didn't occur to him that you'd want to use the @ sign for, like, doing a mention to a person's name or something of that nature. So if I uncheck that and I now delete these notes and hit extract Tinderbox, you'll see that Tinderbox has now automatically gone out and created me tasks and populated the owner attribute value. So Becker owns this task, Bruce owns that task, all of us own this task, and the source of every one of these notes is today's meeting and this date. And I didn't get to and I didn't get a Tinderbox file name because I've actually not saved the file yet. So let me go ahead and save that file, and I will email this to you guys so I can go. Downloads, DBX lesson.
Make sure you give it a good name.
15 July 3 meetup.
Edit 5, version 6.
Yeah. And so now watch this too. Now that I've named the file and I've given a value to the attribute document name, and we go redo it and apply that task. You'll now see that the file name, the task has the file name now too. The reason why I do that, this allows me to copy and paste tasks between Tinderbox files, and I can always know where that task originated from. All right, so I got to go. Mark, can you pick up from here and explain that process?
Sure, and I'll watch the email and it'll come in.
Actually, no. Let me just drop it into the chat.
Yeah, okay. I think one thing that I sort of recall that probably pertinent to a question Bruce may have is that a really difficult thing at the out of sort of learning this is that the logical question says, well, why are you using TSK hyphen and why not ABC question mark? It's whatever you put in there. This is the difficult thing, because it's that transitional step between this is a magic thing you type in and magic happens, to saying, I want a different sort of magic, and I don't like TSK. I want to use something else. It's just a step. The thing is to ease into it gradually. There isn't an explanation, but there are lots of things. The one that I think confuses people the most, perhaps, is when people are doing loops. So you do a list dot each. Now, in the notes that I write for ATB Ref, I use
Hey, real quick, Mark, can you make sure you can download that file before it
got
disappears?
it. Yeah. Well, I'll just check it's coming out. Yep. And it opens. Okay. Yeah. So we've got that. I'll put that up on my screen now. So
All right, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah. So it's hopefully you can see this screen. You can see the file again that we were talking about. Let me find where's he? I'll find that. Let's find. So here, for instance, you might look at that line I've highlighted and say, well, why is it let's move that one, expect it to be, sorry. Why does that say a line? Well, the answer is you can call that anything you like. The person that wrote the text, in this case, Michael, used a line. And all it is, so in this case, it's what it's saying is within the text that's done by these curly brackets, wherever I say a line, what I'm actually doing is I'm referring to the value of the item that's currently being looked at. So if we had a list of 4 items, we'd look at the first, we do run all this code on the first item, and where we use a line, we're referring to that value. It's quite powerful. It's not intuitive when you first meet it. If you've never had any exposure to a sort of coding background, it will be obvious for those who do. But it's fairly simple. I've tried to document it. I won't try and find the page. So I'm looking there. There is a section under automating Tinderbox in ATB Ref now that basically describes some of the syntax ideas. And in that, I've tried to explain why I use certain naming for particular things. And it's probably there to infuriate people who know how to do it, but it's mainly there to help people who've never done it before. So it gives you some idea of what's happening, but you don't have to use those things. It's not a requirement. The problem is people tend to otherwise use really short things like saying, each X. And that I found when I was first sort of trying to learn these things, I found that so inscrutable, it just made things unnecessarily hard. But I'd never, at that stage, I'd never done any formal programming at all. Art has a question.
Yeah, hey, hi, how's it going, man? So I've always been curious about this. When you introduce that line, the vtext dot each line, is that also the same moment you're declaring that variable?
Yes. So yeah, good point. So where it's, I suppose the formal term is a loop variable. So basically a line only means something in the context of those inside those curly brackets. And then it magically disappears.
Okay, fine.
Yep. But you could call that, I mean, you really can call it anything you like as long as it's a valid name. And seriously, so the thing I find, because I don't have much formal training, I put a thing that it is. So if I'm iterating a list of a list of prices, say, I put a price, because when I look 4 months later and I look for where we've when I look there, oh, right, so it's adding the current price, the price of the current item. So it's not, this isn't, don't think that every time you use .each, you have to put something saying a line in there. It is in the documentation, I try to say that you put in what you like. The point is that having declared a line, you then, for the rest of this bit, that's what you use.
Yeah.
You can't use something else because you won't get the variable value. But yes, it clears itself up. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to declare, in that case, you don't have to declare it. It's confusing perhaps because originally, this predates, in fact, variables. Over time, and especially in the last couple of versions, Tinderbox has become a lot richer in what it allows you to do. So it now has variables, it has typed variables, it has functions, which actually makes things potentially a lot harder to understand because it just gets more abstract. And for those who don't have exposure to the sort of the formalism of that, more and more stuff sort of happens behind the screen. Bruce.
Mark, you just touched on something that is probably my biggest challenge, that all of the codes and rules and every action code and everything else that follows is based upon a basic structure. And I understand that, and I get why Michael is using abbreviations in front. I do something similar in spreadsheets. I think it helps with organization. But the problem for me that continues to occur is that with all the years I've used Tinderbox, I haven't been able to set on a particular way of using it. You know, when I'm setting up a spreadsheet or I'm using other software, there's kind of, in a way, it's the restrictions of that software, and Tinderbox doesn't have those restrictions, but it's almost as though it gives me too many choices. And I would so much, you know, I've looked at videos and everything else. I can't find kind of a consistent way that for what I do, you know, right now I'm preparing a series of lectures, for example. What is the best way to structure that? So then when I extract and I use my action code and everything else, then I'm able to, you know, query the database in manners that are meaningful.
Well, I suppose that the first response is with much power comes much responsibility. So in other words, you know, you make it, it's yours to break. But to more seriously, I mean, you raise a good point. I think I'd offer two observations. One is just break the task down into sort of, think of it in chunks. Okay, so I want a list. Well, how do I make that list? Okay, I'm going to have to find something that makes the list. So you too often a simple way is almost work from the end backwards. So I need to end up with this thing. Well, how would I get that? Well, I could get it from over there, but then I get too many things, so I need to find the right one. And that gives you a pointer to the bits you want to use. The other side of it is the more personal side. Yeah, but my style of doing things, so I looked at somebody else's version of that. That doesn't sort of make sense. I probably would couch it in these terms, even if it's just using variable names and attribute names that make more sense to you, or it may be, as is the case, there is more than one way to do things in Tinderbox, and you know there is more than one way to generate a list of things. So it's find things that make sense to you, and broadly, if they work, they work. And I wouldn't bother to don't worry about, if you see people talking about performance, if you don't have an issue with things sort of running slow, don't worry. You'll understand the problem when you hit it, and not many people do. The sort of thing that Michael does in some of his big files, it will, because there's a lot of automation going on. And then you need to get a bit clever about stuff. But don't worry about that out of the gate. Do something that just makes sense, because you get more confidence that way. The more things that work, you know, first time, the more your confidence will come to do other things. And that doesn't stop you taking something that maybe someone's posted a solution that you really need in the forum and it just works, and that's fine. And don't worry if you don't understand all of it, because frankly, in the moment, if you've got to get a task done and it does the task you want, that's fine. And you can always come back later and ask in the forum, say, hey, I copied this stuff and I don't quite understand what it does. That's fine, because actually things like that are much easier to explain to somebody, because you're starting from the context of a problem. You know, I know the start, I know the end, I just don't know how it happens. You know, how is the sausage made? Do I even want to see it happen? Does that answer that at all?
It does, and it also brings back the, it's so funny, a programmer I hired 20 years ago made the same comment that, you know, people who don't want to see, you know, people who don't want to get involved in software development, you know, probably should never visit a sausage factory. You know, that's that seems to have held. But yes, what you're saying makes sense. And every time I find a new feature that I've learned from the forums, I frankly get excited in a way that I don't with other pieces of software, because it feels like such an accomplishment. Yeah.
And the other thing is that, I mean, the more, unless you're someone who's very, very used to programming, where if you're doing it all day, then any extra keystroke is a tax you don't want to pay. And that's fine. It's absolutely fine. But for most of it, it's not like that. You're probably going to write some code, and it might take you an hour. It might take you all afternoon to do. But once it works, you may not look at it again. But bear in mind that of sort of writing stuff that other people can read, because other people happens to include yourself in 6 months' time. And if I'm just looking at a really complicated thing I did for someone under version 5, and I know that the idiot that wrote some of that code was me, and I don't quite understand what I was doing, because it's almost 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, Chuck is
and
professional.
also you
Wonderful.
couldn't comment then, which you can now. And again, don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of putting comments in, even just to remind yourself as you go that it again, if you're not hitting any problem with performance and things, putting a few extra characters in there is not going to be problematic. So think about helping yourself, you know, whether it's tomorrow or whether it's in 10 years time and you want to understand it. And also, if you can understand it, probably other people can as well.
Thanks.
But you don't have to. So, you know, if you don't need to, you don't have to. It's not a rule. And you know, we are in a perfectly valid sense a mixed ability class here. We come, you know, people, the degree of exposure that we have as Tinderbox users to this sort of quite abstract coding varies across the piece. So don't worry if other people are doing really complicated stuff. Do the stuff that makes sense, and you, as you say, you'll find something that makes work, and that's one more, you know, brick you put in the wall. And next time you won't have to worry about that. If that's answered that, I'm going to move on to Chuck. Is that okay, Bruce?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, go Chuck.
So let me first offer an observation about what Bruce just brought up, which is that I think part of the challenge people have sometimes following what Michael and others do is they don't have the same problem. But let's say that Michael or somebody who's done a complex Tinderbox application has. And I would observe that a little bit like with spreadsheets, and people who work with spreadsheets may recognize this. Sometimes you use a spreadsheet just to throw a bunch of numbers up and do some quick calculations. And it's all you're ever going to do with it. You don't care. Other times you do that 4 or 5 times. You say, you know, I really should clean this up and I need to share this with other people. And I want to make it so that it's easier for me to customize this to what the particular problem I'm using or dealing with. And at that point, you start doing a totally different type of Excel spreadsheet development. You start using more formulas, you start setting up multiple tabs, you start doing a bunch of other things. And I think Tinderbox is very much like that, in that there are times you just use it for taking notes. You just use it like a fancy outliner or a brainstorming tool where you put up a map and you just draw a bunch of things and show how they're connected. There are other times you can say, yeah, I'm doing this all the time, or I've got a problem I need to solve, which is large and I want it to be repeatable and I want it to be shareable and a whole bunch of other attributes to the problem. And at that point is when you now dive into doing approaching Tinderbox from a totally different direction. And I think it just might help to say that we all tend to operate in these two modes. We do the quick and dirty, and then when we're kind of pressed to the wall, we do something more elaborate and more detailed, because in the end, it will save us time or make us more efficient or allow us to be more accurate. And it's just
Yes, and the cruel irony is that in doing that, when somebody asks us something, we to get it done quickly, we do the quick and dirty, and that of course it's not what we meant to do, because we were trying to inform somebody else. Guilty as charged.
Well, but you know, I think, you know, quick and dirty is how much of what we do in the world gets done. Let's be honest, and not chastise ourselves for doing it that way. But let me raise the question I really wanted to, that I originally put my hand up about. Michael was using the term offset. And I don't know, Mark, can you indicate how widely that is used in Tinderbox? Is that a well-defined term in Tinderbox? Is it a informal term?
I think I'm probably to blame for it. The problem is that there was no term for it, and our illustrious leader chose not to give it a term, and I don't have, and it probably has an official programming description, but I suspect that if there was one, that most of the people here wouldn't mean anything anyway. So I had to pick something, and the reason I said offset is, you know, because effectively when you say $$ attribute name, you get the value of this note, the current notes thing. So if you want this attribute, but for something else, which I sort of formalized the term offset because so I'm to blame, really. I think I'm open to a better description. I'm not sure there necessarily is one.
I just wanted to point out, because my reaction in hearing that term be used again today was, there are so many other ways that's referred to within programming context. And it could be an index, it can be an address, it can be an indirection. And in a sense, part of the problem is offset makes the most sense if you're, and this may be too detailed for everyone to follow, but in the Tinderbox world, there's this and that. And offset makes a lot of sense when you're trying to describe this note versus that note. In a lot of other situations, it might not make as much sense to use the term offset. It would be an address, it would be a list of pointers that get you to where you want to go.
I think in fairness, I think when I say offset, the word address is silent at the end is probably the mistake, because I think that's really what's in my mind when I started formalizing, sort of semi-formalizing that term. So you're right.
Well, and I'm not in no way am I being critical. I'm just observing that as people approach this is one of the more complex problems to wrestle with as you start doing anything serious, and is how do you reference other notes? And richness how you can do that is very impressive and it's very powerful. But the terminology, I think, is difficult, and maybe it would be helpful to at some point talk about the different ways that you can reference other notes, and maybe introduce some of the other terms that might be more common. When is a reference to another note like an index? When is a reference to another note like an address? When is a reference to another note like a list of names or a path? And what is a path, and how does that relate to you're thinking about these things? I only introduce, I think it's a very important concept, and my suspicion is it's one that it challenges many people. It challenges people in probably every programming language. But Tinderbox has such richness of the ways that it allows you to reference notes that I think it's worth perhaps revisiting a little bit and seeing if there's some ways that the terminology can be mapped to other fields, and that the diversity of options could be explained in a more consistent manner.
Yeah,
As I've
hear,
taken one stab at doing that.
I hear what you're saying. I can think of some things, certainly some further description notes I can sort of add. I mean, part of the problem is that Tinderbox action code is not a programming language. It certainly wasn't written as such, and it just growed like Topsy. So it's got all sorts of complex and gnarly bits and simple bits down the middle. And for years, all people really ever used was the name. I happen to break that a lot, because the main thing I used Tinderbox for was writing about Tinderbox, and therefore you were using all the terms of things like designators as note names, and all sorts of craziness happened.
Right.
But that's unusual. For most people, you just stick the name in there and you go with it, and whether you use quotes or not doesn't really matter. I'm also slightly to blame probably for some things about trying to formalize the quoting, and this really came from what now, I don't know, 18 years or something of effectively supporting the community, and the constant confusion of people saying, well, why do some things have quotes and not others? Because when you're at the early stage where it is all just magic, it doesn't make any sense. You just know that, if you type this thing, it works, and if you type something else, it doesn't. And so part of the thing was to sort of try and give some sense that if it's text, you put quotes around it. If it isn't text, you don't. It gets complicated, and that was before we even had things like variables. But I do take your point about offsets, because or offset addresses, in terms of trying to get a variable, an attribute's value from a different note, because that was before we had dictionaries. It was before we had addressing lists using .at and things like that, and there are other ways. And I think you make a very good point, and we could certainly do well to, or I could do well to shim that somewhere into ATB ref. So I'll definitely take that on board. I see your hands down now. So Dave.
Yeah, I'd like to try and parse this extract tasks stamp that you have up here. Starting at the top, V prefix with nothing after the equal sign, that indicates the initial value is the empty string up under the var declarations in the green. Further
Oh,
up.
right. Yeah.
Yep.
So right.
With nothing following that, no two sets of quotes, that implies the empty string, correct?
Those are it's shorthand for that. The reason is that when if you think about it, if you have, say, an attribute, my string, and it has a value and you just want to reset it, you just put my value equals semicolon, and it's just saying reset it to the default. The default of a string happens to be an empty string once you know that. So right. In effect, you can write that, or in fact, you can write it with single quotes, because we won't go down that rabbit hole at the moment, but it's all the same thing.
Okay, so same thing with VNote. It's a string, and the initial value is the empty string.
Except the V string is misspelled.
Correct. I wasn't going to go there. Okay. Okay, so that's commented out. So in the curly brackets below, so text log equals the empty string is commented out. I don't know what that's about. Then within the brackets, he's commented out text log. So I was wondering, what the hell was log referring to?
Okay, right. So what this is using, right. So this is using very lightweight logging. So in other words, so often when you're doing this, because this is all happening behind the curtain, and you get a silent failure. So you make all this code, you press the button, and nothing happens. So what this is saying is, if we had a note called log, so what this is assuming, and the reason it's commented out is he copied it from somewhere else. But if we had that, what it's saying is, go and tell the text of note log, or you could write it. It's all the same stuff. Or you could put that in quotes. So what this is referring to is saying, right, I want to work on the text of this note here. Yep. And then during there, so we start by resetting it, because we want to have we just want to log this bit of code. And then in the loop, he's starting by saying text. So because we need to say which file it is, because otherwise it's going to be put in the text of the file that we're acting on. So the note that we're acting on, and not this one. And so we say plus, and this is quite new. This is the same as saying in older code, what you'd see is this, and they both mean the same. Okay, so that's all the plus equals is doing. It's just it's neater, and I mean, once you get used to it, it's just so much sort of actually cleaner. But sorry, oops, I'm supposed to be an equal sign. But if you see it in the past, it's the same thing. Okay, and don't worry about. I mean, in a sense, don't worry about the indenting. Right. You don't have to use it. Tinderbox doesn't worry about all this white space. What it does worry about is like those semicolons. If you leave one of those out, you'll probably get a silent fail.
What you've cleared up what my confusion was, because I didn't see a note log in the example full file that he created, and then I didn't when he so that initial commenting under text log, I thought basically commented out the whole function or the whole thing, but it just commented out that line.
No, I think it's so you can copy paste it. And in fact, if you run this, all that will happen is that won't do anything, because there isn't it won't make that note for you. Generally, this sort of logging thing is something few people will need until you start to do more complicated things. So I've seen some of Michael's more complicated work, and yes, it's that thing of, well, I'm sure I fed it the right magic incantation, but nothing came out.
So you need a log. So a couple other things, because we're bumping up against the end.
Yep.
So vSource name this. This is a designator for the note, correct? This
where are
var string last string on the var, green, up in the green.
This one. Right.
Right.
Okay. So what you can do is there are various ways you can set it. What you could do is you could say this is a string. So we could say,
No, Mark, stop.
yep.
I was just trying to get you to the right location. So this is a designator, correct?
Oh, sorry. Right. So yeah, I think that's actually superfluous because it means, sorry, keep use of the word this. They mean the same thing. If you don't put something else, it is the same as this.
Okay.
You may very occasionally, if you're doing some more gnarly form of export work, butt up against the need for the word current versus this. But I'll let you, if you need it, it's there and it's described. There are ways in which this is not quite what you thought it was when you're calling something else. So
Okay.
this, that, and current are worth just taking a bit of time to read about.
Right. So there's this, and then there's now, and I understand what now is. That's from the Unix clock at the moment that the note is created.
Yeah.
And then document. Now, in the side, the brackets to the right, the argument for document is in quotes. That seems a little different. You can't just do, so like we have parent this, parent now, but brackets name for document. That's a file convention.
Right. So this actually goes back to the point that Chuck has sort of, I think, quite rightly raised, which are there are a number of ways in which you can do this. What's happening there is document happens to be a dictionary type object. So when you ask the document operator what it gives you back, if you just said text equals document this, actually it works at document level, but it gives you the I think the version number of the application, it gives you the name of the file, it gives you one or two other things. They're documented ATB ref. But so you rightly bring it. So what's happening here, right? The square brackets is a way that you call the value of a key, which I think now I'm finding we're probably best practices to not quote. I know it gets confusing because one of the things I'm going around the houses with on the backstage is saying, look, can we just decide? Because going back to Bruce's point, when you're learning, it matters. Rules matter when you're learning. When you understand it, when you know how to color outside the lines don't matter.
Anarchy.
But the guardrails are there for a purpose. You know, it's like learning to ride a bicycle. At some point, you take the stabilizer wheels off, but most of us need them to start with, or we need someone holding the saddle for us. It doesn't matter which. But the point is, if they're not there, it's all very confusing, and it tends to end up with you lying on your side. So yeah, I'll revisit that. But in this case, it's saying, right, for the dictionary object that is the dictionary of information that is returned by the document operator, I want the value of the key that's called name, which happens to be the name of the Tinderbox file, and there you go.
I understand everything else. So
Yeah. No, it's always obvious after the fact, and it can be quite inscrutable. The difficulty is that normally the square break. The other thing you'll begin to see is that I just typed it in the end, but you can do things because you can now nest lists inside lists. You might find something like you can call if the second item in a list was another list, you might say the second item is 1 because annoyingly for most of us it counts from 0, and you might say I want the third item in the list that is the second item of the list. So if you begin to see that creeping in, but it again, this is one of the things I'm in the process of trying to find a simple way to document for learners, but because I've been through this loop myself, and so if I think about it, it's because I just found it incredibly complicated to learn because I'd never been formally taught this. And the problem is, if you learn this formally, you learn it over a longer period in nice, neat steps and in a very abstract way. And most of us are just jumping into this, and we don't care about that. We just need to get stuff done. So finding simple ways to explain things is difficult. I'm noticing the time. Chuck, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation since you've got it up on the screen, something that many people may encounter. If you look at the sequence of variable strings, there's something different about the last one. It doesn't line up. And when people start copying things back and forth, the simple reason is that line has a different font.
I think it has a different, it has a
Different
space
typeface.
in the colon and the var. The var space colon, I think.
No,
No, it was a different font. You're absolutely
it was a
right.
different font.
Yes.
And I just point that out to people because that's when people start copying things back and forth, that will happen to you, and it can be when you're trying to be neat with your code, or you get a strange character suddenly showing up. It doesn't matter to Tinderbox, but it's visually jarring to someone who's working with the code and trying to interpret what's going on. So I just mentioned to people that's one of the things that, because it's a text string, you can mix fonts, and sometimes that won't matter at all, and other times it will confuse you. So I just thought, since the example was there, I'd point it out.
So exactly. So here you are. I've just pasted some text in, and lo and behold, it's a different font. Now, it used to be that people say what you had to do is to select everything to reset it. A useful thing that now works is that you can select the note, and you just press standard font, and it will set it into the font that's being used. Because two things are happening here. The coloring is being applied, the syntax coloring is being applied because this is using the built-in action prototype. And I have just had Mark confirm to me, because it's a question I was asking him for the new release. I said, it is the case that although it was broadly intended for stamps and functions, so these locations in hints, if you make it, as lots of us done in the past, what we might have referred to as a code note, we'd written a really long rule. It was too big to read in the inspector, so we put it in a note so we could work on it. If you want to set that to use an action template, action prototype, so that you get the code coloring, that won't do any harm, which is quite useful. And the other thing is, as Chuck's pointed out, if it just looks weird, two things you can do is you can reset the font, and that basically will reset everything. It will preserve bold, underline, and italics. Annoyingly, if you've got some text and you're using the code font, you're using this, it will reset that to the normal text. There's a feature request for that. And something else that's coming through is this. Well, sorry, this is a backstage release. This will be here in 9.6. So if you want to set the code font, and I'll explain what that is because some people might not know, you can do that using that. And the other thing is now, I think in the new release, you'll be able to select a whole lot of notes and use, it's there. This is grayed out in 9.5.2, and I just had to reset 500 notes by hand for a project I'm working on. I was not happy. So, but all these things is, it always was, well, no one's ever asked for this before, and somebody asked for it, and it can normally be manifest. I'll quickly explain, because some people may not have seen it. Let's just pick something here. So if I've got some, I just put some context. If this was a code sample, what I can do is I can go in here, and you'll see it goes in a monospace font. And that font is set by $code font, so you can set that to whatever you like. And just to make the point, if I go to here and I press format standard font, well, that's interesting. Oh, that's something else that's been fixed. So it doesn't step on that now. So, but for instance, if just to make the point that if I had, if I just make that for a second italic, and I made this much bigger. If I do reset standard font, oops, sorry, because I've got the code in there. If I do format, it should set. So you'll notice this now went back to the same size okay, but it didn't step on the italicization. Oh, and this time it has reamed out the code font. So it just shows. But I hope that makes the general point. The other thing that you may, for long-term players who've got old times, is until version 6, there was all sorts of margins that you had, and if you've got a very old file, you may find that some paragraphs are all stepped out, and that's where you want this, which is reset margin. Sadly, it has no shortcut. It probably now, since I asked about the other thing, can be done to multiple notes. But what it does is effectively, if you're something that will become more apparent if you were using a ruler and you played around with the styling, effectively it just resets the whole note to the standard style of a new note, if that makes sense. Just make sure I haven't made too much damage to Michael's file. No, I'll just put that back. We might just put
Thanks.
there. So I noticed actually we're past the end. Are there any more questions?
I thought this was a really good session, almost an intro to Tinderbox type session. So kudos to Michael.
Well, I think it's good. It's actually useful to go back over these things because to a certain extent, it helps to have tried and failed at least once before you understand why it was you failed. Because to a certain extent, otherwise you read it, so that don't make sense. And then you have a go and, well, it doesn't work. And it doesn't tell you why.
Just a comment, Mark, to dovetail with what you were saying earlier about guardrails. It would be helpful, at least for someone like me, almost to see 3 or 5 different ways that people are using it, where they start off, they go through just as Michael was in the early part of his presentation. Because what I continue to experience is that, and it could just be me, I feel as though there's a certain point where my lack of programming background becomes evident. And I'm trying to hold, and I move from feeling that I can master it with a couple of hours of practice to feeling as though I need to take a course in programming to know what I'm doing.
I think where the disconnect comes, or the thing to do when you reach that point is to switch from thinking about the task you're doing, as in, I am trying to write a template to export something, or I'm trying to do this, as to switch to the sort of abstract thing, saying, I'm trying to make a list. And then you can just concentrate on making a list. And the other thing is, I know comes up often, is sometimes if you've been banging your head against a bit of code that, is more like this, and there's a particular bit that isn't working, this line is not working, just stop, make a new note, and do that one task and check it works. Because very often, when you're doing a longer bit of code, what you're actually butting up against is not the problem you thought you had, it's something else. So you might think you're just about to write an angry email saying this thing doesn't work, when lo and behold it turns out it does work. The problem was something else, but it was really, really hard to see it.
I always assume it's me, by the way.
Well, you're a marvelous exception to the rule. That I do feel for developers, because there are endless and powerful stories. The day starting with the first email said, you've just ruined my world. But it's sort of natural, because in the way that often we turn up on a forum at the point where we can take it no more and we really need to let someone know about it. And it's a very natural thing. But going back to, again, looking back to your question, I think the thing is, if you tried something and you feel it's not making sense, just ask yourself, am I trying to understand this in terms of whether I've got the right answer or not? Which is something we do a lot. Does it look right? I tried it, it didn't work. Okay, well, step back from that.
Going back to where it last worked and removing anything extra that's not working, regardless of what it is. I mean, I find that effective in my more complex nested, spreadsheet formulas, for example. I
Yep.
think it's the same logic here.
Chuck,
Yeah, I was just going to observe that I think when people start looking, saying, gee, I need to go take a programming course, what you probably would get out of that more than anything else is learning how to debug. And a good part of being able to program is not that you have some ability to magically incantate the right code, but that you've learned the skills of debugging the problem in your code. And I think everybody should be focusing more on how do you put things like the logging function that was illustrated in this piece of code snippet we're looking at. How do you put something in there that makes it easier for you to find your problem? And then even if you don't find your problem, when you ask for help, you've given other people a means of seeing what you might not be seeing. And so I think, shifting your perspective to one of how do I debug rather than one of how do I program might be a helpful step.
yeah, and a very simple way of, I mean, in the sense, and the least sort of scary part of that is literally just doing a small test, because often, trying to eat the whole thing in one go is clearly proving too much. But the nature of the beast is, Tinderbox is designed to not give you a plethora of messages saying can't do that, shouldn't have done this, stop now, stop, walk away. So you've got to think, okay, so how can I reveal this? And so things like logging, or just the fact that, okay, I'm using dot each line and it's not working. Okay, well, let me go away and just make a very simple thing and confirm my sanity that, yes, I understand how it works. If I put this in, I get this out. And then you can say, well, wait a minute, because I think this helps to the debugging, which again, if you haven't got that as a sort of formally trained experience, it's getting started. Because, if you want to show someone debugging, you might take some really complicated code. So right here is how we debug it. And then half the room is saying, I don't understand the code. Understandably. And so you're right, but I'll have a think on that too. Because I think it's a really good idea, and it's something probably to do for a meetup. It probably needs some prep, and part of it will be finding a problem that is complex enough to need debugging and simple enough that everyone in the room's got a sporting chance of following along and getting something from it. So, unless there are any parting notes, if you care to show yourself out of the room, because this is recording on Michael's machine, and he'll come back and close it up and top and tail it, and I don't think I'll send him the file, apart from some typos. I think it's as it was. And thank you all.
Thanks a lot.